In this video, we're going to take the time to learn about JSP expressions and the page context attributes and variables that we can use through the page context variable. What we'll need is the WAR file, JSP Expressions and PageContext.war, which you can get from your resources. Go ahead and load that into your system. And then once you get that loaded, what you'll see is that we have our DB stuff as usual, and we have one servlet for login user, which we're going to access. We're going to have two new pages, start here and second page, which we're going to use for page context stuff, as well as just some additional expression stuff once we know how to do that. And then we'll have the nav bar, which of course is going to add a couple options. The login is going to change just a little, as well as the list cities, so that we can use some sessions and cookies. And the list cities is going to make sure that users can't view the cities until they've actually logged in, so that we can have that information in play and use that to our advantage. So if we look at the code here for list cities, what we can see is that we have some variables declared for user ID, password, and the DB manager. And we're going to check right away if the user has logged in. So if they have, the session will be set, and we can go ahead and pass them on to the rest of the code. If they haven't, we need to dispatch them off to login. So when we try to log into list cities the first time, if we haven't set any variables into session, haven't been authorized, we'll redirect to login so that we protect the page. Once we're there, of course, we can get the user ID and password, and that allows us to access those variables and use them in an expression. So here, if they've logged in, the user ID won't be null and it won't be equal to the empty string. So what we'll see is that we can actually just write in our code here, say h1 welcome back, and then we'll use an expression to print out the user ID, which is less than % equals, and then the variable name % greater than. So it's just an easy expression to access that variable. If they've logged in, of course, then we'll go ahead and do the same code we've done before, where we have our DB manager printing out all the cities to the page. Application, of course, is our servlet context, so we can use that directly here. We no longer need to worry about getting the servlet context. Also, sessions are also directly accessible through implicit objects, so now we don't need to declare a new HTTP session. We can actually just say session.getAttribute and access them directly through our pages. So the user tries to hit list cities, they haven't logged in, so we're going to redirect them to login. On the login page then, what we're going to do is have our cookies that we can retrieve in case they've remembered themselves, as well as the user ID, password, and an auth level. So here again, we'll access the session. If it's null, then we'll try to get the cookies. If the cookies are set, we can get those values set. If the sessions aren't null, we can use those. And then when we present the login page to the user, we can simply say, here's your user ID and here's your password. And the other thing to note here is we are using expression in the text field. In order to do that, we put that into the value just like we would put any string. But here we have to wrap it with quotes just like any other string and still use the expression code. So we have less than % equals our user ID % greater than, and therefore that will render any user ID string that we've set, which we set to an empty string in case other things aren't set so we don't get an error. Let's look at login user really quick, because once they hit set, we're going to go there, and we just want to verify that everything is going to work the way we expect it. We'll pull the user ID and password from the post that was done by the login page. We'll simulate the login just like before, and we're going to direct to listcities.jsp. But since we're going to be doing this across multiple pages in the future, we set up an attribute variable for destination, and that way we could direct to different pages if we wanted to change to a different page, such as list countries in the future. And we're going to give them the ability to remember themselves, of course, just like before. Now we're going to add the cookies for credentials, user ID, and password that they can select to remember themselves. And therefore, the next time they come back to the page, they won't have to re-enter their username and password. It will be populated for them. Of course, once we've simulated the login, then we're going to redirect if it was bad for some reason to log in. Otherwise, we'll redirect to our destination, which in this case is going to be the list cities. So let's go ahead and try to run the system. We'll try to go to list cities right away. What we'll see is that a previous session was already in action from my previous testing run. So let's go ahead and clear that out using the clear sessions and cookies. Now we'll see that when we try to hit cities, the sessions aren't active. There's no cookies in place. So we need to enter our information. So we'll say infinite skills, and we'll just give it any password. It's irrelevant. We're not testing anything. Let's go ahead and select that we want to be remembered and sign in. Now what we can see is that it knows who we are because the user ID was pulled from session and used an expression to print out to the page, and our cities were printed now that we have the access that we expected. So that is a quick look at the expression part. Now let's take a look at page context. So let's go to the page Start Here. And on Start Here, what you'll see is that we've set up a bunch of different attributes that we're going to put in place. The page context itself has different scope level access, which is really nice because we can actually set and get attributes from those different scopes. Now the default is the page scope. So if I set an attribute and don't specify a scope, as in this first case here, then what happens is it actually goes to the page scope. As soon as I leave this page, start here.jsp, that variable is lost forever. So we won't see this on our second page. Then I want to show you that you can also set directly into the application scope. So this would be available across the entire application for all page context application scope variables with a secret code. We'll use a session code to show that we can set something into session using the page context. And then, just so that we can see a couple other things in action, we still have access at this level in our JSP to the request attributes, as well as the query string parameters by setting the destination. So we have a couple different codes here. One's just going to be called key, another code, session code, secret code, and lost code. So each one of those is going to be in a different scope and available in different ways. So the first thing we're going to try to do is just use the regular old response send redirect to the destination, which will print out the query string, including that key. Now let's look at second page before we run it quick, because what I want to do is just go over a couple things for you here. When I get to the second page, I'm going to be pulling variables from the page context. I'm going to try to get the DB user ID, which is an init parameter, from the application scope. Unfortunately, that won't work. So what I need to do is remember that I can use the application implicit object, not the application scope, to get the init parameter. So we have that in place. We'll set that into DBUID success so we can see one works and one doesn't. They're all going to have the same syntax. It's going to check if it's null. If it's null, it's just going to set the string to bad. If it's good, it'll actually just set the string to what the parameters returned. That way we can display all of this right to the user so we can see what's going on. So our user ID, of course, is going to come from session. Now you'll remember we set this when we log in. So that's nice to know. We have full access to the session scope even if it wasn't from some other page context directly set. We can just intercept that session scope and use it. The secret code, of course, we put that directly into the application scope, so we'll be able to do that, no problem. The another code was put into the request scope. So we do have access to the request scope at the page context level. But what we'll see is depending on how we redirect, this is going to be very important for us. So if we set into the request and then we do a send redirect, our request will be lost. And so we'll see that this A code or another code the first time is going to be bad, and then we'll change that to show you how to keep it good. The P code, of course, is going to be the request scope. Again, we're going to try to get that key, but we'll see that that will never work. And so what we need to do is use the request variable itself. Just like we did for the DB context, here we have the request implicit object, which will allow us to get that parameter key. And we have that lost code, which will never show. Now, the other thing I did was I set using expressions, everything is going to print out onto a table, but I used some scriptlets and some code. If it's bad, I'm going to color it one way. If it's good, I'll color it another way, just so we can easily see things in action. So let's go ahead and run our start here this time. Hopefully our session will hold from before, and we'll see that we still have our user ID, our application level is there. The page context application level DB didn't work. Neither did another code, the key from the request scope at the page context, or the lost code. So let's look at the page context again here in the code. So let's change from response to the request dispatcher. Let's go ahead and run that one more time. And here we'll see now our another code is also working. So if we want to keep our request parameters alive, we have to use a dispatcher. And that brings up one last thing that we need to look at with the page context, and that is going to be that we can actually use pageContext.forward, which will do the same thing and just send us right to the destination. Just a little easier way to get to that request dispatcher. And so you'll see that our another code is still set to live.